Friends and neighbors came together after a call was put out by City Councillor Dave Newman to find a way that we could respond to Senator Murray Sinclair's call to action. Friends and neighbors took up this call and decided to create the lecture series with the hopes that we might spark a greater dialogue in this community. It is also our hope that the thoughts and ideas generated here will help each of you to find your own ways to act on the concept of reconciliation in whatever large or small manner you see fit. It is our responsibility to face some truths before reconciliation can begin, before we can re-engage our treaty partners. There could be no hope of achieving reconciliation without each and every one of us taking on the work to seek our own creative insight into how this can be accomplished. One of the ways that we can begin this work is by re-educating ourselves about the legacy of colonialism, the truth of the residential school experience, and the generational impact that this has had on the original peoples of this land. Without a clear understanding of the role of the treaties that were forged before and around the time that Canada was formed, we cannot understand the responsibilities that we are now facing. Nathan Tidridge, who presented our first lecture last month, made the case that the Royal Proclamation and the Treaty of Niagara can be seen as one of the many Indigenous Magna Cartas that continue to live and grow in these lands. He also stated that Confederation redefined a non-Indigenous settlement on these lands and subsumed and attempted to forcibly replace treaty relationships. Confederation also opened up the door to establishment of the Indian Act and the residential school program that flowed from it. But Nathan also pointed out last week when he was here, a talk that he gave at the Woodland Cultural Center, that treaty, the word treaty, is not a noun, but rather it is a verb, and that treaties are living documents that need to be nurtured. Tonight, Mr. Ray will speak to these points and the vital roles that treaties play in any reconciliation. I would like to now pass the floor over to Janice Montour, Executive Director of the Woodland Cultural Center, who will give us an update on the Save the Evidence campaign and the work that is progressing at the Mohawk Institute.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Friends and Neighbors for allowing me a chance to speak to you briefly about our Save the Evidence campaign. As one of only a handful of residential schools left still standing in Canada, the Mohawk Institute Indian Residential School is a physical reminder of the legacy of assimilation imposed upon First Nations children in Canada for over 150 years. We have over 15,000 visitors to the residential school every year, and the relevance and impact of this historic site is evident. Visitors come to see not only what was once the longest running residential school in Canada, but to experience, more importantly, the stories the building holds. In 2013, major roof leaks caused significant and costly damage to the building. The Save the Evidence campaign was launched in response. Its goal is to not only raise the necessary funds for repairs and renovations to the building, but also to create a significant cultural and learning space. This incredibly unique opportunity will not only allow future generations to better understand the residential school system and the impact it had on First Nations people, but more importantly, it will give a voice to those children that were silenced for too long. The campaign actually exists in 3 phases. Phase 1 addresses the urgent need of repairing the roof. Phase 2 will address the necessary mechanical upgrades needed in the building. And phase 3 is the creation of the cultural and learning space. We still have a lot to fundraise, but I'm very happy to report that we have been able to begin renovations on the building. To date, we have raised $2.2 million towards this campaign, and this would not have been possible without our incredible donors, fundraisers, supporters, and government. There are many ways that you can get involved with our campaign. Donations can be made in person or online. You can purchase your very own Save the Evidence t-shirt, book packages, and all of our proceeds will support our campaign. We offer a lot of resources to help make your fundraiser successful, and I'm happy to discuss any of these and how you want to get involved in the campaign further. These are just some images of the 3rd floor where the roof renovations will take place. This is a panoramic view of the girls' dormitory side of the 3rd floor. at our building. So currently we are closed to the public during renovations, so we're doing very limited tours. But I'm happy to say we will be doing more work and filming to help ensure that people still are being educated and receive the message. Thank you. Now
The Woodland Cultural Centre has been around since 1972, and they began the process of reconciliation by building up the culture that was diminished through the years of the operation of the school. So I think what Justice Sinclair is asking all Canadians to address, they addressed it starting in 1972 in their own way. So it's a terrific project. My task is to introduce our speaker, and that's not a heavy duty because he is so well known. The Honourable Bob Rae is a former Premier of Ontario. He started his political career in the federal parliament, and then he transferred his career to the Ontario legislature, became Premier of Ontario, and then later on he went back to the federal level and he ended up ending his career in Parliament as the interim leader of the Liberal Party. And I had the good opportunity, along with a couple of other city councillors, to travel to Ottawa to meet with the then Conservative government officials, along with the County of Brant, and we were in support of Six Nations who wanted to get their negotiations underway, and they weren't being listened to. So we went there and we met with Mr. Rae at that time, and he was very, very supportive. Now, since then, he's retired from politics, and he went back to his trained career of being a lawyer. He's an excellent lawyer, and a lot of the work he does these days is specialized in the area of Indigenous activities. So we are just so delighted that he was able to come to Brantford, and let's give our guest speaker a rousing welcome.
I want to say how pleased and honored I am to be part of this lecture series, and particularly want to express my appreciation to those Indigenous nations who have been on this land for thousands and thousands of years and have welcomed us and have helped to educate all of us in understanding who we really are as Canadians. I'm going to try and do something in a relatively short space of time that is not easy to do, to try to sort of summarize how we got to where we are right now, but also to try to point the way to some things we need to do in the future. I will take up the challenge of what reconciliation means to me. And reconciliation means to me two things. It means that each one of us, as an individual, each of us has to go on a certain journey. And it's a journey of discovery and of awareness. And it's a personal journey. It's not up to someone else. It's not somebody else's fault. It's not a general enterprise. It's a very personal journey of trying to understand when did I first learn, when did I first realize or think about who are my Indigenous neighbors? What is the nature of our country? And then to continue on that journey to say, what can I do to really try to make a difference in what has become such a challenge for our country. And that's why I know many of you were brought here by the title of my talk. So that's why the title of my talk is Mending Hearts and Mending Treaties. Because I firmly believe that the challenge that we face as Canadians is not just a political challenge, although it is a political challenge. That's the second half. That's the mending treaties part. But the mending hearts part is about our understanding and appreciating that insofar as there is a gap between us, insofar as there is an ounce of racism or a smidgen of misunderstanding or a dose of just not connecting, we have to cross that bridge. And we have to do it as individuals. And that's true whether we're Indigenous, non-Indigenous, settlers, those who've been here for thousands of years, those who've come here just recently. It doesn't matter. There are gaps. And there are gaps in our own knowledge and understanding and awareness. And each one of us has to make a journey. And part of that journey is understanding how to walk in someone else's shoes. Or this week, someone else's moccasins. And it's personal. It's not out there for someone else to do, it's for each one of us to do. I'll come back to that at the end. But for most of what I want to talk about, it's in addition to that personal journey, it's about understanding better the political journey we have been on as a country. Some of the myths and falsehoods, stuff that we were brought up. I say we, I mean non-Aboriginal people. The things that we learned about who we are as a country. And I want to cut through a couple of those big myths. And I want to talk about the meaning of treaty. And then talk about how we actually can move forward. What are the next steps that need to happen? In my opinion. Well, the first myth is what I call the myth of discovery. When I went to school, I was taught, and I went to school in Canada, and I went to school briefly, primary school in the US as well. I was taught to celebrate the discovery of America or of Canada. I was taught about Cartier and Champlain, and I was taught about Christopher Columbus, and when I went to public school in Washington, D.C., I was taught about John Smith, and the settlement of Jamestown, and all of those stories. The reason they were stories is the stories were based on the premise that this part of the world was discovered by Europeans. It was a miracle, you know, they were looking for China or looking for India, hence the word Indians. But they were looking for something. And when they got to these shores, they put a flag down. It was either the British flag or the Spanish flag or the French flag. And they claimed it and said, this is our land. Ignoring the fact, of course, that this land was already occupied. It's estimated that there were as many as 3 million people living in North America, and that there were as many as 15, 20 million people living in the Americas. So the mythology that somehow this was a vast wilderness that was not populated by anyone, it's just untrue. It's false. There was no discovery of the Americas by Europeans. That didn't happen. The land was already occupied. For a long time, legal scholars developed a theory about how was it that when people got here, they got to claim that it was their land. And they said, well, easy, we have to assume that the land was occupied, and in Latin they developed a term called, this was terra nullius, literally, the land of no one. It didn't belong to anybody, so first come, first serve. And so a lot of the arguments between the French and the British and all the others was to say, well, who got here first? Well, I think we have to dispose of that myth. And we have to relearn our history and understand that our history starts well before Europeans got here. The history of the Americas really starts with the end of the Ice Age. Tens of thousands of years ago, when the ice receded and this land became habitable and livable. That's when Indigenous people discovered this land, and it became theirs. And within each Indigenous community, there's, as we all have, we all have narratives and stories about our foundation and our discovery, and who we are and where we come from. And we learn these narratives. But the key point is to realize that the discovery of this land, the first people who occupied this land, are Indigenous people. They got here first, a long time before anybody got here. And the theory that the people who lived here didn't have languages and religions and customs and laws and beliefs and ways of life is also a lie. The people who lived here had laws, they had customs, they had a way of life, they had an economy, they had a way of living with the land, had a way of relating to the land, they had a way of relating to one another. They had wars, but hey, what? You know, there were a couple of wars in Europe between, you know, as I recall, quite a few people got killed in some of those wars. And yes, there were wars here too, and no question. But we need to embrace that history as part of our history. Sometimes people say, "Oh, that's prehistory." You say, "Pre what?" No, it's not prehistory, it's history. It's our history. And it's our history. It's our common history. And we have to embrace this history. And for many of us, we have to learn about it. We have to learn cultures, languages. We have to embrace who we are and appreciate and understand that it's not somewhere else. This is the land that we now share. Yeah. We share it, not very well, but we share it. But we have to embrace all of it, so that there's nothing in this culture that we don't try to understand and embrace and appreciate. So as we get rid of the doctrine of discovery, and as we get rid of the doctrine that this was the land of no one, we then have to begin to come to terms with the price of the encounter. The encounter was not pretty. The arrival of Europeans was not pretty for a number of reasons. The first was the encounter of two immune systems. I've talked about there are now estimates of what the population of Canada was, or the land that is Canada. It's fair to say that over the next 250 years after the encounter became more serious, it's estimated that as many as 90% of the Indigenous population died. They died as a result of disease. They died as a result of the incompatibility between two immune systems, between two peoples who had never interacted before in human history. And the consequence of that interaction was absolutely catastrophic. Catastrophic in all of the Americas. All of the Americas. This was the first great catastrophe, and it was the catastrophe of disease. And even in the residential school experience, there were still people wrestling with disease, with tuberculosis, with illnesses which they had contracted by virtue of contact with people who were carrying with them diseases that had never been encountered in the Americas before. The second was the catastrophe of conquest and the view that the Europeans brought with them that somehow they were on a mission. They were on a mission to, quote, civilize. They were on a mission to assimilate. They were on a mission to convert. They brought with them their theology, which stated that those who did not embrace their theology were bound to damnation and needed to be converted. They brought with them a sense of their superiority as a culture. They brought with them all of the attitudes of conquest, which by the time the 19th century came along, were even given the false coverage of science. And much of anthropological and sociological and biological thinking in the 19th century was based on the premise that there are races which are superior and there are races that are inferior. And the Aboriginal cultures were necessarily inferior. And that view was widespread, deeply seated in the European culture of those days. We need to understand what that did as well as what disease did. Because we can only understand the residential school experience as part of what I call the evil trinity of 19th century policy in this country, of Victorian policy. The Indian Act, the numbered treaties, which I'll come to, and the residential schools. They all went together. And the premise at that time was that because the experience had been that Indigenous people were such a small portion of the population compared to what they had been before, a common assumption of 19th century Victorian Canada was that the Indigenous people would simply disappear. And in the case of the Beothuk people of Newfoundland, they were right, they did disappear. They were killed off. They died. If you go to the museum in St. John's, you can see the diary and the pictures of the woman who was the last surviving Beothuk woman. And that assumption was widespread. So the residential schools were part of this trinity. What do I mean by the trinity? Well, the Indian Act was the act that said, we are limiting you to certain spaces and places. We are defining who you are and who you are not. We are putting you in your place. You can't vote. You can't participate. You can't be one of us. You live over there. Oh, and by the way, if you leave over there, you no longer have any status. You've lost your place. You either mix in or you die off. Pretty blunt. Pretty provocative language. But it's true. The numbered treaties were intended to get it clearly established that the First Nations had to surrender their land before they could be taken care of by the Crown. And the trouble with the treaties that we have today is that there is this vast gap between the interpretation by the Crown of the treaties and the interpretation within the First Nations of what happened in that common experience. I know Nathan has talked about the Treaty of Niagara. I'm talking more, which is an 18th century treaty. I'm talking more about what was the governing policy of Treaties 1 through 11. What were they trying to do? And the answer is they were trying to get people off the land. And the most classic interpretation that I have heard of the difference between the settlers' view, the government's view of the treaties, and the First Nations' view of the treaties is that for the governments, the treaties were a divorce, and for the First Nations, the treaties were the establishment of a relationship. creating a relationship. And for the Crown, it's very clear. No. We don't want a relationship. We want you over there and out of the way. Which brings us to the residential schools. The residential schools were a way of ensuring that Indigenous culture and Indigenous peoples would disappear. Because they were based on the premise, we're going to come in and take your children away. We're going to seize your children. We're going to come onto your communities, knock on the door, and get your kids. And we're going to take them away, and you're not going to see them again until they're like us. And we're going to make them like us for all the time that we have them in school. And that's why Chief Justice McLaughlin was right and so blunt when she said this was a cultural genocide. Attempt. Because it didn't work. It was based on the arrogance of the view that said, we're superior, our language is better, our culture is better, our religion is better, our way of life is better, how we treat each other is better, and your way is savage, and we're going to change you by taking your kids away. The generation that's there, we can't do much about you, we're going to get your kids. And this was an arrogance that lasted for 150 years. Think about it for a minute. Think about for a moment, it wasn't one generation. When people said, geez, that was a mistake. Boy, did we ever screw up? Prime Minister Harper admitted that we screwed up 5 years ago. Until then, nobody said we really screwed up. The churches didn't say it. The governments didn't say it. Nobody said it. They thought they were doing the right thing. But they weren't. And the causes and consequences of it are with us today. I want every one of us in this room to reflect for a moment on what it would be like as a parent to have your kids taken away when they're 5 years old. Imagine it as a parent. And then, for a moment, imagine it as a 5-year-old. Not seeing your mother, not seeing your father. And then imagine, if you like, all of what we know of what went on. The abuse, sexual, physical, the malnutrition. Thousands of kids died in the residential schools. We can't even get an accurate estimate as to how many we think died because so many of them are in unmarked graves. Why do we only have 3 or 4 residential schools left standing? Because people burned them down. They'd had enough. And this didn't go on for 1 generation or 2. It's been a long time in the making. And that's why Justice Sinclair said 2 things that I think are really important. First thing he said was, the truth will set you free, but first it will really piss you off. And he was right. He said that. I'm just quoting him. And that, I think, is a very important statement because when the truth grabs you, when you really understand what's happened, you say, oh my goodness, not only what were they thinking, but what were the people who kind of are my ancestors? What are they thinking? How did they imagine this was the right path to create a proper relationship? And so we find ourselves now as the inheritors of this. And the second thing that Murray Sinclair said that I think is true and is hard is to say it took us a long time to get into this mess. It's going to take us a while to get out of it. But getting out of it requires action and requires movement. without getting into too much of the detail, you know, we've seen some efforts made and things done to try to get us to a better place. We've seen some things said, done in some cases, but we've got a long, long way to go. And I want to try and outline just some basic things that we are going to need to come to grips with as Canadians. I know that perhaps the most common mythology among Canadians today, in addition to the, you know, to the discovery and the myth of discovery and the myth of surrender, the other myth is, you know, that was then, this is now, and we're spending way too much money on First Nations. And it's wasted. And it's taken away, and there's corruption, and it's all bad, and we've just got to stop that, and we've got to let them be just like us. Well, you know, somebody was giving me this argument the other day, and I said, you know, first of all, per capita, for kids in education and in healthcare and on housing, we actually spend much, much, much less on Indigenous people than we do on everybody else. Go to a school on a reserve and compare it to what we're providing. Look at this facility here. I mean, Max Blau is here, president of the university, with us. 22 buildings have been built in Brantford by Wilfrid Laurier University. How many buildings like this are there on any Indian reserve in Northern Ontario? Don't rush to it. I can answer zero, zero, zero. So we really have to say to ourselves, we have got to take a huge step in recognizing that if we want to get to self-government, if we want to get to a mutual relationship that respects the dignity of difference, but recognizes the fundamental principle of equality, it's going to cost us. And I have a very simple formula, and that is to say, look, in the Canadian Constitution, we say the principle of equalization is in place that says if you're living in Prince Edward Island, you have access to services of a roughly similar nature to those that you will find in other provinces. We do that, and we send equalized, you know, Ottawa sends greater payments to some provinces than others because of this lack of equality. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has found that it is discriminatory to be funding child welfare services at a level that is substantially lower than we're spending in non-Aboriginal communities. It's wrong. It must change. And so my step forward is to say, if we think and believe, that I certainly do, that the First Nations are an order of government that is worthy of equal respect to that of any other government in this country, then they should be funded on an equal basis. If we did that, it would be revolutionary. It would be expensive. People would raise their eyes and say, well, wait a minute. Say, well, we don't have to spend it all in one day. But we have to set out a plan as to how are we going to get there. And it has to be based on these two things that I've said: self-government and equality. Self-government, because all of the evidence strongly points in one direction. And that is that we have taken away from First Nations the ability to actually make effective decisions for themselves. We've done that by forcing them to continue to ask and to beg and to wheedle and cajole and say, we need this, we need that, we need more, we need this. And we've never, ever recognized what sovereignty actually should mean. The 24,000 people who are members of the Six Nations community, the Six Nations nation, should not be forced to beg on their hands and knees. They should have a settlement which recognizes that much of their land was stolen from them in that same 19th century where I've described this evil trinity of public policy. And it's true, it was stolen from them. The evidence is overwhelming that it was stolen from them. And so there has to be compensation for that. There has to be recognition from that. And there has to be, going forward, there has to be a recognition that there is a government here that needs to have the revenues that it requires. All governments require land, and all governments require revenue. And if we're going to have Indigenous governments, they need land and they need revenue. And they don't have it. We put them on little postage stamps of land dotted across the country, 650 of them, and say, go to it. What? And then we express surprise at the fact that, yeah, there are serious social and other issues. But you say, yes, but look at the generational cost that we've imposed on them. So what is amazing today to me is not that this is going to be a big challenge for governments and a big challenge for all of us as Canadians. What's amazing for me is the resilience and, yes, the patience of First Nations people. First of all, resilience. Remember those population numbers I described in the 19th century? The assumption that this was a population that would disappear? Despite our very best efforts of governments over many, many generations, not only has Indigenous population not disappeared, it's quite the opposite. It's the fastest growing and youngest population in Canada. And it is profoundly resilient. We have more people going colleges and universities. We have more people going into every profession. We have more successful First Nations and Aboriginal businesses than ever before. The success stories are dramatic and they are widespread across a very wide spectrum of the country. But it could be even more successful. And don't think that the patience will last forever. Because injustice always comes with a price. And we're seeing now in the younger generation of First Nations, we're seeing a greater awareness, a greater knowledge, and yes, a greater, and understandably, a greater impatience. And that will continue. That won't go away. The progress that we made since the 1960s to today, through all the battles and the constitutional differences and all of the arguments, we have seen quite dramatic changes across the country in governance, in education, but there's still so much more to do. So let me come back and conclude to what Mending Hearts and Mending Treaties means. Mending Hearts means that this has to become a personal cause of the majority. And here's the challenge that we face. Most Canadians are not First Nations. Most Canadians are not Aboriginal. And so, politically, governments look at this and say, yeah, we'll do what we can. We'll make the right noises. But, you know, there's only so much we can do. And so, it's going to take an amazing effort on the part of a majority of Canadians, of non-Aboriginal Canadians, to say, we got to do the right thing here. It's not about, is it good for, is it going to benefit 67 or 80, 90% of the population? Is it going to, now let me just make one other argument that I think we need to think about. The first argument is that as the frontier of development moves further and further north and west in this country, we're heading deeper and deeper into Indigenous country. And the law has changed through a whole series of phenomena. Supreme Court decisions, political decisions, constitutional decisions, a variety of ways. Period. They will not happen without the full participation and approval and consent of the First Nations. They won't happen. And the second thing is that one of the great transformations that's taken place since the 1950s when it comes to the demography of this country is that the Aboriginal population in Canada is an urban population, increasingly so. Go from one part of the country to another. When I grew up in Ottawa, I never met, I'm not proud to say this, but it's true, I never met an Aboriginal person as a kid. I never met one. It took a whole series of changes in my own life where that became just changed. It just suddenly changed, and I began to look into it and find out more about it and learn, engage, see. So we all, we've all gone on, I suspect, a similar journey. Today, in Toronto or Ottawa or Brantford, anywhere else, it's an increasing situation where we're living next door, we're sitting with, we're being with. And when that happens, and there's huge conditions of inequality and vast differences in life experience, we can't carry on that way unless we learn how to share with our neighbor. And sharing goes both ways. It goes two ways. As we embrace this new awareness of who we are as Canadians. So, yes, there's a personal journey that has to be taken that is both personal and that is also political, because you're going to be asked, well, do you support Mr. Trudeau or whoever it may be, Premier Wynne or whoever it may be, when he or she says, you know what, it's not just talk, we can't just apologize and say we're sorry and then not change anything, we have to make some changes, and it's not going to be cheap because we haven't served people well. And mending the treaties means that the great advantage of the treaty relationship is that it is a relationship between peoples, between nations. That's why we call it a treaty. It's the least the Crown could do, was to call them treaties, even if they just said Treaty Number 1. That's an exciting title. Treaty Number 2. And although the Crown has stuck to its very narrow interpretation of what the treaties were all about, the fact is that's not really how we're going to be able to go forward. We can't go forward if we see this as some kind of divorce settlement. We go forward because we see it as a relationship. I love the comment about how treaty is a verb as well as a noun. It's about building a relationship. And this is a relationship that is personal and political. Because you know what about the treaties? It means we're all treaty people. As Canadians, we are treaty people. We're not lords of the manor who pretended that there was nobody here, or we were, but we can't be that way anymore. We have to forsake that way of thinking, abandon that approach to how we see the world, and recognize that it is based on this simple concept of the dignity of difference and the fact that some might have come here to conquer, some might have come here to convert. But neither of those work in today's world. We come to learn, and we come in friendship. And the real story of Canada, by the way, is who do you think got Champlain and company through the first winter? You know, when suddenly they said, hey, we're not in Paris anymore. I don't mean Paris on Highway 24, I mean, the other Paris. You know, we have to understand something of the real history of our country. And that is that the first people who came here survived because they shared the land with those who took them on the route. How do you think we developed the fur trade? Because guess what? There already was a fur trade. There was a fur trade long before the Europeans got here. There were people who were trading from the south of Canada to the north of Canada. There were relationships that had been established, yes, by treaty between First Nations about how we're going to get along. And yes, there was commerce. And there were exchanges. There were all those things. And when the Europeans came, they said, hey, let's build on that. And eventually they said, let's just take it over. So really what we're doing is returning to the very best of what the wisest ones thought about this relationship. And that's why we have to mend hearts, and that's why we have to mend treaties. Thank you very much.
Your words that you said, this has to become a personal cause of the majority to correct the wrongs, and I want to know what you think we can do to help that. How can we get the majority of Canadians to get on board?
Well, I'm a big believer that this journey starts at home, so it starts with each one of us. It's already clearly started in your case. And then I think in each community, you have to say, well, what can we do? As it so happens, this is a community where there's lots to do. There's some very practical issues that have to be worked out with the First Nations who are your neighbors. And that is, you know, I mean, I would be, you know, less than honest if I said, and those things are easy, because they're not easy. We all know how things can get, you know, lines can get drawn in the sand and people can go on either side, and we know there's a lot of issues to go through. But I think one of the great things that the Friends and Neighbors Project is doing is saying, well, let's look and see what we can do practically to engage. And I think that's why this is such an important project, and I'm very pleased to be associated with it. I think it's really, really, really important. I think we need to make sure that the kids are learning better than we did, that they're learning a different history than the one we did. I say we, I mean, you know, our generation, you're obviously much younger than I am, but you know, I think we all know that, you know, I went to school in the 50s and had no clue. You know, wasn't taught any of this stuff. And when I went to university, it was very difficult to find out. There's nobody teaching, you know, Indigenous history at the University of Toronto that I could find, maybe anthropology or something, but, you know, so you've got to really hope that we can begin through education to make a big difference. So, personal commitment, it's the neighbor commitment, it's doing stuff locally, it's working on the education issue, and then I think it's becoming part of really trying to talk people through on what the next stage of the relationship is going to be at the provincial and the national level. And that's a much, I could go on for hours about that, but I mean that's really sort of where I see it starting.
I've been involved in this area for a number of years, and there certainly are some things that you suggested this evening for me to think about, and I think for all of us too. A gentle reminder, and I know you know this, that the United Church of Canada did offer an apology in 1984 at General Counsel, Very Reverend Robert Smith, and it was not accepted, has not been accepted, and for very good reasons. And I think that indicates the importance of relationship, that until the relationship has been brought into focus and has been made right, that apology cannot be accepted. My question is, we are accepting a number of people from around the world, from many different cultures, and I'm proud of Canada for doing that. How is it that we involve those people on this journey of discovery?
That's a great question. I think that was something that new Canadians should be taught about and explained about in any discussion about Canada. And the second thing is, I think the more we can take people to places. I mean, the great thing about the Mohawk Institute is you don't have to go a gazillion miles from where 5, 6, 7 million people are living and say, you know what, all the stuff you've been hearing about the residential schools, here it is. And that's one of the reasons why I think this project of trying to turn the Institute into a place of learning and understanding, get people to see what it was really like and understand and hear the stories of survivors, and then, you know, come to appreciate why this is such a critical part of our history and a critical part of our understanding. So I think there's a lot we can do to bring it. And sometimes I have to say, I hear from Indigenous people, you know, we shouldn't be letting so many people in because, you know, you're not paying enough attention to our issues. I've heard that, and I say to them, it's not a zero-sum world we live in. There's room in the human heart for a lot. It just keeps expanding. Love keeps expanding the more you give. So don't put a limit, don't put a cap on your love. And that's why it's so important for us to be accepting of doing what we can for people who are facing critical situations in the world. But it also means we have to realize and remember about our own tasks that we have as Canadians. I appreciated your reminder. I think it's important. I also think that there's sometimes we think, not only in this instance, but in personal instances, I'm sure that all of us can reflect on this for a moment, that we think that once we've said we're sorry, well, that's it. You know, I mean, I apologize, I'm sorry, and you kind of say, so the other one is, let's move on. And suddenly you realize the person to whom you're giving an apology says, not yet. Like, really, like, let's try to understand what happened here. And so I don't think anybody should be surprised that at first blush, and within Indigenous culture, 20 years is first blush, or 30 or 50 years is first blush. You know, don't expect that suddenly you're going to say, oh, okay. That's why the Truth and Reconciliation process was so important, because it allowed people to tell their story. It also forced even more of an apology from governments and from the churches. But I think anybody who thinks about this will know and understand the process of being sorry is not just about the words. It's about what else are you going to do. And that's why the political agenda becomes so important. I was in the House of Commons when Mr. Harper delivered the apology on behalf of the Government of Canada. And it was extremely eloquent. You can see it on YouTube. It was very good. The problem is that there was no subsequent political agenda, really, or not enough of a political agenda to say, not only are we sorry, this is the things we are doing to do everything we can to make amends, knowing that making amends is a long journey. I realize as a non-Indigenous person that I am going to be sorry for the rest of my life. And that is just a reality. That it isn't enough to say, oh, I'm sorry now, you know, is that enough? Are you over it? And one of the worst words we can think of, it doesn't really, I hear it used sometimes by, you know, some people, journalists, you know, they say, well, do you have closure? You know? And I can remember this personally happened to me. My wife lost her parents in a car accident many years ago. Instantly killed on a Sunday afternoon. And about 2 years later, somebody said to her, he says, do you have closure yet? And she looked at this person and she said, I will never have closure. I will live the rest of my life with that being part of my life. So don't talk to me about closure. And that was something that I learned when I did the Air India experience, working with the victims of the Air India bombing, you know, the families. I learned that. I learned very quickly that a lot of people were saying, the government was saying, when are we going to get to closure on this issue? I said, how is never settled? It's never long enough for you? Of course, this wasn't the political answer that everybody's hoping for, but it happens to be true. Sir?
A little more practical question.
Yeah.
The Six Nations is located in an area where the inhabitants have an opportunity for education and employment. I'm concerned about our northern communities where people want to stay home where they're brought up. They want to stay with their families. They have suicides going on across Canada, but in the Indigenous areas, because they don't have a future, they don't have jobs, they don't have employers flocking in there to establish factories. How do we help the northern communities develop opportunities for their children so that they can stay home and yet lead a life that's satisfying?
I think it's a huge question. I think it's one of the biggest questions because these communities desperately need to somehow become sustainable. And you say, what can we do? Well, the first thing we can do is break down the isolation. The kids in those communities feel alone. The people are physically and geographically isolated. The problem, the challenge is they're no longer technologically isolated. So kids can, 50 years ago, you'd listen to a radio program on reserve, but you wouldn't have access to television, you wouldn't have access to a computer, you wouldn't know what was going on in the rest of the world. Today, there's nothing in the world that goes on that a little 2-year-old kid in the coldest, grimmest house on the most distant, remote reserve that's only accessible by air and by winter road in the winter, that they don't see. So what do you think happens as they grow up and they say, that's that world and this is where I am? How am I going to get out of this? How am I going to... And so there's a huge issue of how we connect with those communities, with the kids in those communities, with the families. I think a lot of the solutions that people talk about are frankly just totally simplistic, saying, well, we've got to get people out of there, we've got to close them down, we've got to move people. You just say, we kind of done that and tried that, it hasn't worked, it's been terrible failure where it's been tried anywhere, so we're not going to go there. What we do have to do is figure out ways to make the communities more sustainable. And frankly, it means initially we're going to have to invest more money in those communities to give them better education, to provide them with more access, to make sure that they've got greater ability, and recognize that it's not going to be instant, but there are some practical, real things that we can do to make sure people have opportunities. It's no accident that the urbanization phenomenon that I've described is taking place, because there is a depopulation of the reserves that's going on right now. And it's going on because the communities are not sustainable. And that's something that the communities feel very deeply. And that's why they want to become more sustainable. Some of them are lucky if they're next to a natural resource development of some kind, but again, that is a mixed blessing because the communities aren't necessarily ready for that kind of speedy development, and the communities aren't necessarily able to take advantage of that, and so they don't get the full benefit of that development. And that's something we need to work on in practical ways to make sure it starts to happen. Way at the back, for anybody who couldn't hear it, the question was about the protests going on in the United States, the importance of reestablishing a linkage between all of us and Mother Earth and Turtle Island. How can we make sure that people are not incarcerated because they're engaging in legal protest? I mean, first of all, I'd say, and you prefaced your comments by saying that I'm a lawyer, so therefore you'd like my advice. I would preface it by saying that my advice is worth what you're paying for. It's not much. But I think it's fair to say, first of all, the law in the U.S. is a little different than the law in Canada. I think that the situation in the States is challenging. The basic principle of international practice now, thanks to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, is that Indigenous people have to provide, as you know the phrase, free, prior, and informed consent before any development happens on their traditional territory. So under that test, it would appear pretty clear that there is no free, prior, and informed consent to the route of the pipeline that has been chosen in North Dakota. Now, whether that principle will be applied within American domestic law, I don't know. We'll have to see. But certainly it's the view of the protesters that what they're doing is entirely legal and should not be subject to an injunction or to moving them off the land. In our own country, I think I have to say the law is evolving. It's partly a contested reality. The law evolves in response to disputes and governments taking certain decisions. There are examples in Canada in Ontario, where a community said, we do not want this mine in our traditional territory, and ultimately the province said, okay, you won't have it. It won't happen. There are others who take the view that, well, if you're talking about a pipeline, for example, how do you ensure that, is it every single community on the route that has to agree, or is it most of the communities along the route? And the answer to that is, I don't think we have a decisive answer to that question. But if it's going through a community's property, like through a reserve, there's no argument. You can't interfere with a reserve property without the permission of the reserve community. Now, I'm not going to enter into the 100-year-old Six Nations debate about is it the governance of the elected council or is it the government of the traditional chiefs. I'm not going to go there. But it is an important question, and it's still unresolved in this part of Ontario. One of the reasons why we have not seen more rapid progress in dealing with the implications of the dispute between the Six Nations and the governments of Canada and Ontario is because of that internal divide, and that's something that has to be resolved. But I think it's fair to say that there is a greater awareness today in our own country of, first of all, the importance of the environment, secondly, the relationship between Indigenous people and the environment, and, more broadly speaking, the rights of Indigenous people. I think that's more widely understood, appreciated, and frankly enforced than it was 30 years ago or 50 years ago. And your generation will play a role in making sure that that continues to happen. I'll take one last question.
Thank you for your brilliant presentation. And I'd like to know, was there ever any presentation like that made in front of the Parliament at the federal level or provincial level?
Well, I spoke quite a few times, both federally and provincially. I didn't have a chance to speak at such length as I had tonight, but yes, I've given a similar talk in both places. I have to say that I think, this is in a sense reinforcing the answer to the previous question, we're getting somewhere, but it's slow and it's difficult. And as I said before, it's contested. It's not universally accepted by people. And so I think we're working at it to make sure that we make good progress. Thank you very, very much.